good day.
Maayong buntag, that is good morning in Cebuano. Magandang umaga, that is good morning in Tagalog. And welcome to the Philippines and to the 12th Energy Ministers Meeting. Before we begin the sessions today, we would like to call on to give the welcome remarks and the introduction of the guest of honor and the keynote speaker, no less than the Philippines Department of Energy Secretary, Zenaida Y. Monsada, who is the chairperson of the 12th APEC Energy Ministers Meeting.
Thank you, Rico. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates and guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning on behalf of the Department of Energy and the Philippine government. It is my distinct honor to warmly welcome all of you to Cebu and to the 12th APEC Energy Ministers Meeting, or what we call EMM 12. As the overall APEC 2015 theme revolves on building inclusive economies, building a better world, we agreed to hold the various APEC meetings in the different provinces to show the world that every part of the Philippines has something wonderful to offer and to contribute not only to the growth of our economy, but of the APEC region as well. Cebu is one of the Philippines' urban cities with the highest GDP. Thus, opportunities abound in this side of the archipelago, called the Queen City of the South. Anchoring on our tourism slogan, "It's more fun in the Philippines," that has become viral in social media. You can view smiling faces of Filipinos captured even after the catastrophic event of Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda known locally, which one of our leading newspapers, the Manila Times, described as a magnificent tapestry of human resilience. The theme of this year's EMM highlights the thrust for resiliency of APEC communities. Resiliency has been a buzzword for APEC 2015. In the APEC Study Center's Consortium Conference 2015, it was noted that there is a need to establish the resilience of businesses, even the small and medium-scale enterprises, in times of disasters to ensure continuity of operations. Our finance ministers also highlighted the importance of financial resilience, along with infrastructure development to sustain economic gains of the region in their Cebu Action Plan. APEC senior disaster management officials are also working on a disaster risk reduction framework to improve resiliency of economies. We are very much aware of the ill consequences brought about by natural and man-induced disasters to people's lives, property, businesses, and the economy's resources. The higher levels of frequency and intensity of these disasters has caused an alarming call even for the most advanced and most prepared economies. The APEC senior disaster management officials actually call this part of the new normal. Thus, today's agenda brings to the forefront APEC economy initiatives and collective efforts to ensure energy-secured and sustainable communities capable of withstanding the unpredictable environmental changes and adverse effects as economies modernize and expand. Moves to attain energy security, however, must now take into consideration incalculable effects of disasters, especially to energy infrastructures. We have seen how communities are paralyzed during disasters when such infrastructures are affected and damaged. We all recognize that energy serves as the bloodline of economies, and without reliable energy supply, economies will recover slower or worse, will not function at all. We hope, therefore, that APEC member economies will come up with innovative measures and avenues to foster greater cooperation to ensure energy security, sustainability, and now resiliency, especially that APEC accounts for about 60% of the world's energy demand. Cooperation is extremely important at this day and age, given the rapid economic landscapes that are being built and developing between and among economies. As an example, information from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center shared with local communities that will be affected is a significant step towards fostering disaster awareness, preparedness, and mitigation. Communication of relevant and accurate data is an effective solution in addressing disasters and will enable economies to save more lives and minimize impacts economically and socially. We are happy to note that our economies are working together to double renewable energy use in APEC economies by 2030 and a 45% reduction in energy intensity through improved energy efficiency systems by 2035. We are now looking at exploring the utilization of next-generation transport systems, developments in building and grid codes, and green industries under the APEC Energy Smart Communities Initiative. It is also notable that we started the APEC Low Carbon Model Town project, which allows us to showcase new technologies and best practices in urban planning and in terms of energy efficiency and conservation. For this reason, EM12 will be tackling 4 sub-themes. First, climate-proofing energy infrastructure. Second, improving energy trade and investment in APEC. Third, advancing cutting-edge energy-efficient technologies. And fourth, promoting community-based clean energy use in energy poverty-stricken areas. Given the future of the energy development in the APEC region, member economies are encouraged to conduct a vulnerability assessment of energy infrastructure to determine the costs of disasters to energy infrastructures and to be able to avoid them, as well as to create cooperation and share best practices that will guide policy and program decisions to ensure reliable and sustained production, thus enabling delivery of energy products within APEC to mitigate adverse supply disruptions. Fostering energy resiliency also need not to be too costly. We encourage the utilization of available energy-efficient technologies with the most cost-effective impact. This hopefully will also translate to positive impacts to the public by encouraging energy performance standards in the building codes, energy appliances, smart metering devices, industrial equipment, fuel quality, and vehicle efficiency. Of course, energy resiliency should be a priority for all communities. Thus, we'll also discuss strategies to establish energy infrastructure in poverty-stricken areas or far-flung provinces to encourage development for a more inclusive growth. We would also like to welcome the international industry experts to expound on energy resiliency to address the twin challenges of energy security and sustainable development. At the end of the day, we hope that APEC economies will also learn, aside from protecting the energy infrastructures, how to get up, recover, and build more resilient economies and train people to be more proactive for the benefit of their communities and cities. Yesterday, our senior officials have worked hard to refine the draft of the declaration that we will issue later. But before we focus on finalizing our declaration, let me introduce our guest speaker who will share with us some local energy scenarios and valuable insights in line with our theme. For the past 3 decades, She has dedicated her life and work to serving the Filipino people as a lawmaker and a passionate advocate of green growth and sustainable development. She has authored and sponsored landmark laws on environmental protection, disaster risk management, and climate change adaptation, namely the Clean Air Act, the Solid Waste Management Act, the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act, the Climate Change Act, and the People's Survival Fund Law, among others. She is also the co-author and co-sponsor of the Renewable Act. In 2000, the World Economic Forum named her as among the global leaders for tomorrow. The year after, the United Nations Environment Program named her its laureate and included her in the Global 500 Roll of Honor. In 2008, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction appointed her as its champion in the Asia and the Pacific region with a high-level mission to enthuse world leaders and lawmakers to mainstream disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation into development. In 2012, the United Nations recognized her as a hero of resilience, in line with the celebration of the International Day for Disaster Reduction. She is also the only female to top the Philippine senatorial election twice, and the only woman to serve as majority floor leader. Now, on her third term, she chairs the Senate Committees on Finance, Climate Change, and Cultural Communities. In the Philippine history, she's the only woman chair of the Finance Committee, so we expect a sexy budget this year. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker, it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Senator Loren Legarda.
Thank you very much, Secretary Monsada, and welcome once again to lovely Cebu. We're actually in Mactan, and allow me to greet all of our 21 economies present here today. Zhao Shanghao, I hope I pronounce it correctly. Buenos dias, magandang umaga, maayong buntag, good morning to all of you. I'm deeply honored for this opportunity to address the 12th Energy Ministerial Meeting. APEC's 21 member economies is home to about 2.8 billion people and account for approximately 57% of the world GDP and close to 50% of world trade. It is said that because of APEC's hard work, and I quote, growth has soared in the region, with real GDP doubling from just $16 trillion US dollars in 1989 to $31 trillion in 2013. The statistics of APEC build a solid case, and I quote, average tariffs fell from 17% in 1989 to 5.2% in 2012. And within the period, the region's total trade increased over 7 times, outpacing the rest of the world, with 2/3 of this trade occurring between member economies. Consequently, per capita income rose by 45%. And as the adage goes, millions were lifted out of poverty. To what extent growth has been translated to equity and fair opportunities for all is, of course, a different discussion altogether, but I will touch on that later. The connection between free and open trade and investment and poverty reduction, many would say, is indisputable. With reduced trade barriers comes increased trade, and therefore growth and prosperity comes not too far behind. Let me hasten to add, however, that the sum of 1 + 1 is not always 2. Development is indeed good. But development without conscience destroys the world. we end up zero. Development and the choices we make, the enlightened choices, should not be a zero-sum game. It is for this reason that I welcome the work of APEC in the energy sphere. The theme of your meeting, towards an energy-resilient APEC community, resonates deeply and passionately in my own advocacy as UN champion in Asia-Pacific for DRR and climate change adaptation. So when Sec Monsada and the DOE family asked me during a budget briefing to be their speaker today, I did not think twice, and I said, of course, it will be my distinct honor. As a nation, my resolve on the subject is deep and personal. Asia-Pacific bears much of the brunt of climate change, accounting for more than 80% of the global loss of life due to disasters. Why do I speak of climate change in an energy meeting, you might ask? Energy security and climate security are two stories under the same plot. There is strong scientific consensus that climate change is largely the consequence of greenhouse gas emissions. And as you know, these emissions largely come from human activities, including burning fossil fuels for electricity, heat, the transportation, and even agriculture. The Asian Development Bank projects that energy demand in Asia-Pacific will almost double by 2030. With development comes greater demand for energy. The Asia-Pacific region is poised to have a 3.2% growth both in 2015 and 16 from a 2.9% expansion in 2014. Clearly, the Sustainable Development Energy Nexus requires an urgent examination of how the region can tap on the power of innovation and new technologies to provide for the energy it needs in a sustainable and socially inclusive manner. These are the issues I wish to underscore today. First, across Asia, 610 million are still without access to electricity. Second, energy decisions have mainly been rooted on affordability and expediency as primary considerations. ADB, in its 2013 Outlook report, cites that by 2035, the majority of the region's primary energy demand will still come from fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. Third, more than half of the global population live in cities. The ADB report poignantly pictures the problem, and I quote, "Cities consume 78% of the world's energy and contribute more than 60% of all carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, while covering less than 2% of the Earth's surface." We know all these issues, but solutions are sometimes hard to come by. A great man once said, and I quote, "Sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. Let your greatness blossom." I'm referring, of course, to the late, great Nelson Mandela. 10 years hence from the time that he said that, we are still seeking for innovative solutions, not just to the daunting problems of poverty, but to the looming threats of global catastrophe brought about by climate change. The first energy ministers meeting was held in August in 1996 in Australia. It was the year the Philippines first chaired APEC as well. And just on a side note, I recall that was in Subic. I was a young journalist covering APEC for ABS-CBN television at that time. As early as then, ministers already talked about the adoption of a strategic approach to reducing environment impacts on energy supply and use. From this meeting, I understand that you have identified 4 key, very important themes for discussion. Climate proofing, energy infrastructure, already mentioned by Secretary Monsada. Second, improving energy trade and investment in APEC. Third, advancing cutting-edge energy-efficient technologies. And fourth, promoting community-based clean energy use in energy poverty-stricken areas. This event is an opportunity for all of us to address issues that need immediate response and propose strategies that will augment present initiatives of APEC. The APEC Business Advisory Council, headed by Doris Ho is here, the ABAC, the voice of APEC, has been very forthcoming in its views on the region's sustainable energy agenda. Energy security, it is said, will increasingly depend upon the policies that support green sustainable growth. I join ABAC in welcoming the APEC leaders' ambitious commitment to double the share of renewables in power generation by 2030. Technical innovation will contribute greatly in this endeavor. It is time to achieve progress in these commitments. Allow me now to briefly give you my humble views on the 4 themes of your meeting. Climate proofing. The energy infrastructure system receives the brunt of disaster impacts. This results to disruptions in business and in the delivery of basic services. Interconnecting systems is considered as one of the most critical features of the energy sector. Natural hazards put the highly interdependent energy system at risk. Disturbances in the energy system, in turn, upset our economic activities and cause distress to other critical infrastructure sectors like transportation, water supply, communications. We need to give focus on risks, as understanding our vulnerability supports decision-making in the context of climate change. And so we see here a marriage of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in planning and climate proofing the energy infrastructure. The approach being advanced by the Philippines is the incorporation of information parameters and benchmarking in carrying out vulnerability assessments and emergency response planning. Our aim is to identify major energy networks that may be compromised by natural hazards which abound. I actually have authored 3 laws which are already being applied and implemented in the Philippines. The Climate Change Act of 2009, which created the Commission on Climate Change, chaired by no less than President Aquino. The Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction Management Law, which created the NDRIMC Council, which is tasked with preparing the Philippines for the 20 or more natural hazards which come to our shores. And the Renewable Energy Law, which is being implemented by the Department of Energy. Our experiences with Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, whose intensity is unmatched in recent history, gives us crucial lessons. The total damage to the electricity sector then was $155 million. The distribution utilities were the hardest hit, which accounted for 76% of the total damage to the energy sector, causing disruptions in electric supply to residential, consumers, and even public buildings. This underscores the importance of building adaptability to the energy sector. Climate proofing energy infrastructure has become a basic necessity. APEC and its member economies need to cooperate with the private sector, including ABAC, towards fostering public-private partnerships that will encourage the adoption of appropriate templates or standards for critical energy infrastructure. Second, improving energy trade and investments in APEC. The Asia-Pacific region, according to ADB, requires between $7 trillion and $9.7 trillion in the energy sector, 2005 to 2030. creating a fiscal space for investments in climate-resilient infrastructure by providing easier access to markets, to finance, and innovation. These are crucial. Energy trade and investment can be affected by barriers, which creates obstacles to fair competition. These come in the form of quotas, of export subsidies, procedural hurdles, local content requirements, just to name a few. They can also come in the form of behind-the-border barriers, such as poorly functioning financial markets, weak legal systems, restrictive regulatory approaches, among others. Bottlenecks also come in the form of inadequate infrastructure, power grids, road and port facilities. But one of the biggest hurdles comes in the form of regulatory overreach. These bottlenecks lay the predicate for a status quo, with economies continuing to embrace technologies that are easily accessible and even cheaper, but very harmful to our environment. Business environments need to adhere to the rule of law, considering the businesses will not only be willing to invest in an economic space that provides predictability, transparency, and fairness. Investments in resilient energy infrastructure generate sustained economic and social benefits and deserve the highest priority for policymakers. Third, advancing cutting-edge energy-efficient technologies. We live in a world with finite resources, and yet generations have lived over the centuries like there is no tomorrow. Our natural environment has been compromised. We all need to acknowledge and embrace this sorry and sad reality. It does not mean, however, that we can just stand idly by to witness the continuing decline of our environment. New, cutting-edge, energy-efficient technologies are within our reach. I am therefore encouraged by APEC's commitment to reduce aggregate energy intensity by 45% by 2030 from 2005 levels, and wider use of energy-saving equipment and technical innovation will contribute greatly in this endeavor. We need to heed the private sector's call for governments to take decisive action on environmental services, including further identification and elimination of non-tariff barriers to environmental goods and services, and support for the development of low-carbon and renewable energy technologies. Many APEC economies will continue to generate power using fossil fuel, including the very harmful coal. It is imperative that the best available technology be deployed. Diversification of energy sources will promote disaster resilience. Investments in sophisticated sustainable energy technologies augur well in reducing harmful emissions, protecting health and the environment, and sustaining still economic growth. APEC economies need to work with the private sector to develop clean and energy-efficient, climate-friendly technologies, and I therefore welcome ABAC's initiatives that seek to build a culture of technological innovation in our economies. Fourth, promising or promoting community-based clean energy use in energy poverty-stricken areas. The final theme touches the very core of the APEC 2015 theme, building inclusive economies and building a better world. It can't be better said. Growth is difficult to imagine without energy, and energy that does not take into consideration the needs of future generations can only destroy and not build. This brings me to my final point I made at the onset: development, sustainable and inclusive development, progress, and the quality of life cannot be the exclusive domain of a few. Open trade brings immense opportunities, but unless fair opportunities are shared with all, the prosperity that APEC aims to deliver becomes an empty promise that will begin and end and stop in halls like this. Energy drives economic growth, and yet 1.1 billion globally have no access to electricity. Asia accounts for 615 million. I therefore welcome APEC's initiatives that will provide energy access to everyone, including those in the most remote and backward communities. Clean fuel, renewable energy. They need to be harnessed, and development of microgrids has to be pursued in addressing energy access challenges. Inclusive growth begins with making basic services available to all, fostering the participation of micro, small, and medium enterprises. I'm sure that Doris shares this with me because her focus is not simply big business in APEC and in ABAC, but especially SMEs. So the micro, small, and medium enterprises in the regional and global markets, much less in the domestic supply chain, will not happen unless energy access is guaranteed to everyone. Off-grid and last-mile communities need to enjoy the benefits of APEC as much as everyone else in urban areas. With the onset of technological innovation in energy, achieving universal access to clean energy technologies is within the reach of communities in APEC. In the Philippines, for example, estimates indicate that, and this is not based on Philippine studies, but on the United States studies, that we actually have more than 200,000, in fact, to be exact, 246,000 megawatts of untapped, unharnessed, renewable energy capacity. This is 13 times more than our current installed capacity. I couldn't believe it when I read this research by the US. Failure to develop these capacities would be unforgivable. So, in short, with our 16,000 megawatts installed capacity, we actually have over 200,000. But of course, this includes ocean energy, etc. So we simply want to focus more on R&D so we can harness the untapped potential. And even it may seem a utopia, the 100 million Filipinos can actually eventually find a world where the energy mix is not just 30% coming from RE, but perhaps we can be an RE nation. Again, they'll say, there she goes again, in her utopian mind. But really, the scientists will not disagree. If you have 246,000 megawatts of untapped, unharnessed RE potential in such a wealthy nation, why not? And that's a reason why I will increase the budget of a DOE because of this in the renewable energy portfolio. APEC needs to focus on promoting the growth of low-carbon economies as a means to create jobs and curb carbon emissions. APEC cannot afford to take half-baby steps in its efforts to deliver clean energy to poverty-stricken areas. APEC economies account for 55% of global energy production, but account for 60% of total energy consumption. Clearly, new and cleaner energy options need to be developed. In closing, I wish to acknowledge the role of APEC as a very important global platform that can bring together all the 21 economies in finding sustainable and durable solutions to the region's energy needs. I urge closer public-private engagements and dialogues. Ministers, Your Excellencies, we can no longer address the sustainable development energy nexus on an ad hoc basis. We cannot be business as usual or APEC or ABAC as usual. The world is in an ICU situation. We are in the emergency department or in an intensive care unit. Barely 2 months from now, the world will see one of the biggest gatherings of representatives of government, of intergovernmental organizations, of international UN agencies, of NGOs, NPOs, and civil society and world leaders in Paris by end November and first week in December towards achieving a universal, ambitious climate agreement. As a body that operates on consensus, it might be too much to ask for APEC to lend its voice that would call for positive actions from the COP, or Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Paris. But why not? It is worth making the appeal, however, considering the immeasurable cost of doing nothing and saying nothing. On that note, I thank all of you for bearing with me and for listening intently. Mabuhay. Thank you.
We would like to thank the Honorable Loren Legarda, Senator of the Republic of the Philippines, for your very important insights on energy security and climate security and the key challenges that you've posed to the APEC economies to resolve these ongoing issues as they cooperate closely with the private sector. Thank you very much to the Honorable Senator. And we would like to take this 15-minute coffee break, and we will be back at 15 minutes past the hour of 11 for the opening session. Thank you very much.